Hey everyone, everybody can hear me okay? Yes, all right, good. All right, so this presentation, what we're gonna focus on is securing generative AI. So it's not using AI for security, it's securing the actual AI workload. How many people here are doing stuff with generative AI? Anybody? I'm gonna ask questions, so I want some participation. How many people have actually deployed stuff with generative AI? Couple, okay, couple hands. So this presentation is not going to go very deep. I only have 20 minutes to talk, all right? What I wanted to cover is a baseline understanding of how to think about security with generative AI, because like when you think about with generative AI, there's multiple different things that come into play. There's a security aspect of it, there's a safety aspect of it. And how do you think about security compared to traditional workloads and other things? Talk a little bit about what you need to do with building generative AI workloads with security, and then what do you expect for the future? Because everybody that I know, every week, every month, something new is coming out with generative AI. 2025 is the year of agents, so everybody's talking about agents and MCP servers and other things, and just like from a security practitioner's perspective, how to think about security with AI to make sure that you're building the right security within your workloads. So, when you think about a generative AI application, there's a lot of things that go into it that look very similar to what you have with a microservice architecture. You have a user that sends a query to some type of application, very similar to a microservice architecture. You integrate with data sources, for example, Bedrock knowledge bases. You integrate with tools that are API calls and other things like that, and all that data is then sent to a model that then gives a user output. And one of the biggest challenges that customers have, because they build security with their traditional workloads, that what do they do when they have this large language model or they have this foundational model to make sure that they're putting the right security in place? Because in the end, if you think about a large language model, it's a non-deterministic function. You're sending data to that model, you're expecting a response back, and there's a security aspect of it of, am I going to provide sensitive data that I shouldn't have coming back from the model? Am I going to have safety concerns with things like harmful content and other things like that? And so from a security perspective, what are the security controls that you put in place to make sure that you're building the security properly with generative AI applications? Everybody knows that there's this little thing called agents that takes it up a level of the other things that you need to consider with generative AI security. You now have memory, you have tools, you have goals, you have additional knowledge bases, but instead of just doing a query and response to get an answer back, now you have an agent that is actually observing exactly what's happening, making decisions for you, taking actions that is not just calling a knowledge base, calling a tool, but actually performing something that changes the underlying data, or actually takes an action like I'm booking a flight or other things. And so there's a lot of things that go into play when you are using a large language model to make sure that security is in place so you are building that application properly so you're not having a lot of those security concerns. Who here has seen MITRE Atlas? Everybody's seen MITRE ATT&CK, but who's here has seen MITRE Atlas? All right, so MITRE Atlas is something that's came out that's specific for AI, not just generative AI, but AI overall. And the overall goal of what they have with MITRE Atlas is what are the things that you need to consider when building generative AI workloads to make sure that you have the right security in place. They talk about things with prompt injection. They talk about things with model data training poisoning and other things like that, so you can make sure that you're thinking about the right things when you're building those workloads. All right. So when I talk to customers about building generative AI workloads, one of the things I kind of take a step back to talk to them about is what is different with generative AI workloads compared to traditional workloads. And so if you think about how you actually interact with things with traditional workloads, you either do data access or you do API access. And so when you have data access, what are the expectations that you have with data access? You have structured outputs. You call an API, you're going to give it a certain JSON structure, you expect a certain structure back. With generative AI, you're using natural language. And so the way that someone asks a question can be very different from one user to another. And the question comes up of, okay, if I'm actually wanting to put security with this, how do I actually put security when the actual questions that someone has with natural language could change over time? Deterministic responses. You call a database, unless that underlying database changes, you're going to get the same response back. But with generative AI, depending on how the user asks the question, whether you have a temperature on a generative AI model set in a certain way, those responses could come back different on how many people have ever asked an LLM how many R's are in strawberry. Anybody ever asked that one? Try it out across multiple different LLMs. Sometimes you get the answer 2. The answer is actually 3. And depending on actually how you ask the question, it can come back with different responses, which makes it non-deterministic. And then one of the biggest ones from a security perspective is when you're making API calls, when you're making database calls and other things, you're authorizing a user to the data, all right? Whether it's a row, whether it's a table, whether it's an object that exists in some type of S3 bucket or other things like that. With generative AI, when you send data to a model or you send a prompt to a model, you're authorizing access to the model, not the data that exists in the model. That the mindset that I always tell customers to think about is when you're sending data to a model, any data that goes to the model, you can expect the customer to get it back some way, somehow. So whether that's a prompt injection or other things, so if a user is not allowed or not authorized to have access to certain data you're sending to a model, don't send it to the model in the first place, okay? So back in beginning of 2024, we came out with something called the Generative AI Security Scoping Matrix. Who's seen this before? All right, same person is raising his hand like every time, so hopefully this is good for other people. So the scoping matrix is something from a security perspective of how to think about interacting with generative AI, depending on what type of model you're using. Are you actually using a model that's a public model? So for example, Anthropic Claude or like Meta's AI or other things like that, that the types of regulation, governance, the types of data that you're actually sending to the model, you have to be concerned about what is the security that I actually use sending to the model compared to I'm using an ISV solution. That ISV solution has generative AI where I can ask natural language queries about the data that exists in my ISV solution. You have to start asking questions of where is this ISV storing my data? How is the ISV using that data? And then you get into scopes 3 and scopes 4 where you're starting to build things with Amazon Bedrock. So Amazon Bedrock is a managed service from AWS. We host LLMs for you where you can call API calls to ask questions from the LLM. And then you have to think about who has access to this model? What models am I using? What data from like a knowledge base or other things am I going to put into this? What security mechanisms do I put in place to make sure only users that are authorized to those knowledge bases or authorized to those tools come into play? And then scope 5, you train your own model. What types of data are you actually putting into the model to train? How do you make sure that if this is a public model that you want to give out to your users, that you're only allowing data that is not sensitive data being trained by the model? So you have to think, where are the data sources? How do we make sure that someone's not going to be malicious and actually put data that shouldn't be in those data sources before training the model? And so this all goes into play when you're thinking about how to provide security with generative AI of how your users are using it, how your employees are using it, what types of policies you have in place to make sure that you're using it properly by having the right security constructs in place. Hopefully everybody's seen this slide. Everybody understand what defense in depth architectures are? No one understands? Yeah, couple hands, maybe? Yes. I have one hand, that's all I'm looking for. So just like with traditional workloads, you need to build defense in depth architectures with generative AI. And what do I mean by that? That when you think about it from a foundational layer, getting back to the scoping matrix, do you want your users using public AI models? Do you want your users using sensitive data when actually putting data into that generative AI model? What do you want your users doing when interacting with internal applications or external applications and other things like that? Most of the challenges that customers have is they don't have those policies and procedures in place to know, one, what your users are doing, but two, also how to make sure you educate your users of how to use it properly. Then you get into things like network protection and infrastructure protection. I'm building my own generative AI application. Do I need to put some type of WAF to do input validation? Do I need to put additional security in place of who gets access to that model and other things like that? You have things like identity and access management. Is any user authorized to access a model that I'm building? Or am I only going to let finance department get access to certain data sources? or the sales department get access to certain data sources and other things like that. And that's the same thing that you do with traditional workloads, but now you're applying it to generative AI applications. And it's not until you get to the application protection and the data protection that you start thinking about things like prompt injections. You start thinking about things like jailbreaking and all those malicious things that you read about out on the internet of what can happen when you're building generative AI applications and how do you protect against it. And so from a security perspective, these are traditional security controls that you put in place to make sure that you're building the workload securely. You can't ask an LLM to say, pretty please don't provide sensitive data to this user because they're not authorized for it. You put the right security controls in place saying, how do I pass identity information to my application, or how do I make sure that this knowledge base is only allowed for this user compared to this knowledge base only allowed for this other user. From a partnership perspective, one of the things that we came out with at AWS back reInvent last year was the security competency, a new category for AI security. Security competency, what it does is it validates different partners meeting certain bar from AWS. And so for ISV solutions, we have partners that do AI data security, AI security posture management, threat detection response, in order to provide solutions for you in order to make sure that your data is secure and you're actually building secure generative AI solutions. On a consulting partner perspective, we also have partners that actually operate in this space of being able to go to a partner and say, I'm looking to build security around my workload, being able to talk about it holistically. Not just a partner that says, I know how to prevent prompt injections by deploying this ISV solution, or I know how to set up an IAM role between your front-end application and Bedrock. That we want partners that are validated that can say, I can talk about holistically to make sure that you're putting the right security in place and safety in place to make sure that you're building so you're not the next news cycle of, I just gave 100% discount to an airline or for a customer who's booking an airline flight because I didn't have the right security in place, all right? This market is changing very fast, as everybody knows. So what's the new thing that's coming out? Agents. Has anybody even messed with agents yet? I'd be very surprised. Okay, I saw one little hand, but I've already talked to you about agents. That there's a lot of things that are coming out with generative AI that are going to be new. You as an organization might not touch it for the next year or 2 years or other things like that. But when you think about it from a security practitioner's perspective, you have to think of how does this change the way that I need to provide security? Because it's not just you put an LLM firewall in place and you're good to go. What is the authorization for an agent where I want to contact this MCP server or a third-party tool? Do I pass user identity to that agent? Does the agent pass agent identity to this third-party agent? All those things come into play that you have to think about it just like you do with traditional security controls of making sure that you're providing the right security. You're thinking about it just like you do with traditional workloads, but also understand that you have an LLM in place that's a non-deterministic function, that's almost like a black box, and how to actually build security around using large language models, using generative AI with the new things that come into play. Because it's not going to stop whether it's with agents or what's the next thing after agents with anything with security. But the conversations I have with a lot of my customers, a lot of my partners, is making sure that just like you put deterministic controls in for security for traditional workloads, you're doing the same thing with generative AI. Okay? So happy to have additional conversations if you want to come up and talk about this. But that's what I have for this session, and thank you very much.